Hi, good morning. My name is Jason, and I'm here to introduce our wonderful speakers today, the authors of State of Play and Minecraft, second edition. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
It's all yours.
Thank you. So my name is Daniel Goldberg. This, again, is my co-writer, Linus Larsson. Thanks, again, for coming down to listen to us. We're authors and we're journalists, and we're based in Stockholm, in Sweden, where we write about technology and sort of, I would say, the intersection between technology and society and economy in a variety of different ways for a variety of different publications. And we also write books. A few years back, we released our first book in English, which is called Minecraft, The Unlikely Tale of Marcus Notch Persson and the Game That Changed Everything, which is, as the title implies, a book about the game Minecraft, but also about the guy who created Minecraft and sort of where the inspiration came from and why I would say maybe it's a game that has a lot of things to say. The story of Minecraft has a lot of things to say about the internet, about digital technology, and sort of, the world we live in today, I suppose. It's a great book, so please read it if you haven't already. But today we're here to primarily talk about our new book, which is called The State of Play. And The State of Play is a collection of essays about video games and about video game culture, and more specifically, a collection of essays that all present new and interesting and we would think fairly different ways of talking at video games and sort of approaching video games and maybe even creating video games. So that's what it looks like. So we'd like to spend about maybe 25 minutes to talk about the sort of major themes and the major ideas of the book. And after that, I think we'll have time for some questions. And please do ask questions, because it makes everything a lot more interesting. So I'd like to start off with a question, actually, before we begin. So just raise your hand. Who here has read at least one book in the past month? Okay, so about half of you, which is pretty good, actually. Who here has played a video game, at least one video game in the past month? Almost everyone. Okay, so more of you have played a game in the past month than have read a book in the past month. That's good. So going back to the book then, those of you who read the book, would you say you learned something from reading that book? Or perhaps even better, did that book change your opinion on something? Just raise your hand if that's the case. So almost everyone, I think. Would you say the same thing about the game? Did the game teach you anything, or did the game change your opinion on anything? 1, 2, 3. Okay, so less of you, which is the point, I suppose. That's interesting. We'll come back to that, but let's get started. So video games, right? Video games are everywhere today. Everyone plays video games. People of all ages, people from all over the world. Games are on our phones, they're on our computers, they're on our games consoles, they're on the web. I think it's fair to say that video games today are one of the, if not the most influential forms of cultural expression in the time we live in today, which is sort of in this small room proven by the fact that more of you have actually played games in the past month than have read books in the past month. And also, video games have come an amazingly long way, right, in their very short history. Graphics, gameplay design, gameplay features, the sort of ambition and the scope and the budgets of big video games are now at a point which I think most people would have had a difficult time imagining only, say, 20 or 25 years ago. Just to give you an example of this evolution, then there's two examples. This first game that you can see on the screen over there, at least, Super Mario Brothers from 1985, released for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Who's played Super Mario Brothers? Almost everyone? Everyone? It's a fantastic game, obviously, and I would say, one of the all-time classics, and perhaps also the game that has done the most in sort of shaping our perception of what a video game should be like, what a video game should look like, and what the sort of basic gameplay should feel like. And this is what a video game is for a lot of people today. And jumping ahead, this is a picture from Uncharted 3. There's actually an Uncharted 4 that came out, I think, a couple of days ago or a couple of weeks ago. This was released for the PlayStation 3, by Naughty Dog Studios in 2000. I think it was 2012. Who's played a game in the Uncharted series? A few of you, at least. I absolutely adore this game series. It's a fantastic, really sort of big budget blockbuster, very reminiscent of like the Indiana Jones films, really in scopes. It's a fantastic adventure, and it's really a game series that shows how far I think this form has come in terms of cinematic ambition and sort of storytelling ambition, right? So brilliant series. Yeah, so obviously a lot of things have changed, but there are also a lot of things that haven't changed at all. So going from Super Mario Brothers from 1985 to Uncharted 3, which is just a few years old, many things have changed, but many things really are the same as they always have been. And I think one of the primary things that I would bring up is that both of these games are primarily about the same thing. So Super Mario Brothers and Uncharted 3 are primarily games, or I would say only games, about fun. They're created to be entertaining. And in fact, most video games today are still largely produced as and meant to be discussed as entertainment products and nothing else, really. There's plenty of action, there's plenty of adventures, you're jumping around, you're blowing a lot of stuff up, which is great fun, obviously. But there's also an almost sort of complete detachment from the world outside. These games exist in a sort of vacuum. They exist in their own world, and there's really no attempt made to engage with the world they exist in, sort of social and the political realities these games are produced in. So Super Mario, obviously, it's a game about an Italian plumber in a fairy tale land rescuing a princess, battling fire-breathing lizards and jumping on mushroom soldiers. Uncharted is about traveling to some of the most exotic locations in the world in search of treasures and sort of forbidden legends, forgotten legends, shooting hundreds or thousands of bad guys on the way. And of course, these games, like all cultural artifacts, they carry plenty of meaning. I mean, there's a lot of meaning and subtext here, and there's lots of things that can be analyzed and discussed. But I think it's fair to say that the producers of these games, of both the Super Mario series and the Uncharted series, are primarily concerned with entertainment. Their concern is giving you something that is fun to play, which is kind of the point, the whole thing. There's nothing wrong with this, right? This is for odd reasons, this is a very sensitive topic to talk about, so I just like to get this out of the way before you start throwing things at me, These are fantastic games from a design perspective, and there's not really, of course, we should appreciate them for what they are. I know I do, and I absolutely adore both of these game series. There's a lot of interesting things to be said about technical progress. There's a lot of things to be said about, games design and how maybe the Super Mario series, which is a Japanese series, have brought with it lots of design conventions to the West and influenced how sort of Western game developers work today. But again, just to make that point again, these are games that are pure fantasy. They don't really make an effort to engage with the world outside of their own. They don't really make an effort to carry any sort of social or political meaning or sort of make a point about the social or political realities of the world they exist in. Recently, there's a clear and very interesting trend that we've noticed and many other people have noticed as well, where primarily small and independent games developers have started using games and started thinking about games in a way that is quite different from the way it's been done in the past. More specifically, thinking about how games can be used to conveying stories and messages that try to make a point about real-life issues. Right? And I thought I'd leave it to Linus to talk a bit more about a few of these examples.
Yeah. So you may be familiar with some of these games. I'll take them one by one. The first one is Cart Life. This is a game that was released by game designer Richard Hoffmeyer back in 2011. This is a street vendor simulator, but it could just as well be seen as a game about poverty in contemporary America. Here you play as one of 3 street vendor characters, and they have different backgrounds and features, one being an immigrant from Ukraine, for example. But they all struggle to make ends meet with what little money they get from selling newspapers, bagels, or coffee in an American city. Gameplay in Cart Life consists of like the everyday task of setting up your cart, getting the necessary equipment, and spending what little you make on what is most important. in Cartlife, this will force the player to make some really heart-wrenching decisions, like should I use the money to buy food for my cat, or should I pay the rent so that I'm not evicted, or should I leave work early one day to have the time to pick up my daughter from school, even though it means I will earn even less that day. As you can see here, the graphics in this game is it's simple. It's very the kind of classic pixel graphics that you will see in older games. And that may look primitive, but after playing this game for a while, I have to say that the interaction nature of the game makes you take these choices really serious. Like the more time you invest in the character in the game, the more invested you get in the decisions that has to be made. And after a while, it doesn't really matter how simple the graphics are or how they are being sketched up. You really feel the struggle of the characters. In interviews, Richard Hoffmeyer has talked about how he used the simple graphics because that will allow the player to fill in the gaps themselves, and also talked about how he was inspired to make this game from his own experience from bad and poorly paid jobs. So moving on to the next game, this is Depression Quest, released in 2013 by Zoe Quinn, who is also one of the contributors to this book. She created this tale about depression in the form of a text-based choose-your-own-adventure game. Are you familiar with this genre where you make decisions and, yeah, some of you are nodding, so I assume so. Here, like as a player, you proceed by making decisions in everyday situations that would be very challenging to people suffering from depression. And in Depression Quest, as you can see here, actually, with the red choices, as your condition worsens, more and more choices that would seem like the logical one, perhaps the best decision to make for yourself, are being blocked off one by one. And again, something quite unique to games is happening here. By blocking out options, I think that's a really clever way of using game mechanics to convey the feeling of what suffering from depression can feel like, where good options may be obvious but feel out of reach for the person suffering from the condition. Again, I mean, I think Depression Quest had to be a game. It's all text-based, but I don't think a straight read-through of the material would be very touching. But when investing yourself and your time, something happens and it suddenly feels a lot more real. Zoe was also very careful when designing Depression Quest not to make a simplistic happy ending. So the game is a lot less about solving puzzles in the right way and finishing the game, and a lot more about telling a story of and illustrate the features of actual depression, not just to create a conventional game. Another very good example is Papers, Please. This was also released back in 2013 by a game designer called Lucas Pope. It emulates the work life of an immigrant official in a fictitious country called Arestorska. And Lucas Pope has dubbed this game a dystopian document thriller. When you're playing this, on one level, it is a fairly simple puzzle game where you use documents and rubber stamp to decide whether who should be let in or sent back into the country. And when playing it, it's sort of an eerie feeling, the kind of power you get when you're the one who decides who gets sent back or is let into the country. It is very dystopian, and the setting is completely fictitious, but it's also a powerful illustration of the faceless bureaucracy of modern-day border control. So we're both from Europe, obviously, and you're probably aware of the situation right now, where with hundreds of thousands of people from Syria and other war-torn countries knocking on our door, and especially in this situation, I think like a game like Papers, Please, and the underlying theme of the game is topical, to say the least. In my mind, it's one of the best examples of how games can take on serious issues, serious real-life issues, a lot more than what has been conventional in the games industry before. One more example, I mean, this list can go on and on. This one is called This War of Mine and was released by a Polish game studio just last year. It takes on the very common theme of war, but in a very, very different way. Here, you don't play as a soldier, but as a civilian, or actually a group of civilians trying to survive in a city under siege. I think it's pretty inspired by Sarajevo in the 1990s. You don't take on the role of the sniper, but rather the civilians trying to escape the sniper's shots. And you don't go on missions to try to track down and possibly kill enemies, but you sneak out in the night to scavenge supplies and that you and your peers will need to survive. Also in this game, you don't win per se. The best outcome that you can hope for is to survive long enough for a ceasefire to be called, thus ending the game. And I mean, again, war is very common in games, right? And if most of the mainstream blockbuster first-person shooters will give a romanticized view of war, a game like This War of Mine is quite the opposite. It's a very depressing view of the war, but it's also a very beautifully designed game.
The big question, obviously, is what's new here, right? So all of these 4 games and many more among them are in some sense less, I would say, about entertainment and possibly more about something else. They are, I mean, all of these games are fun and they're interesting to play, sure. I mean, they're great gameplay experiences in themselves, but they also, again, attempt to make a point about something. There's a sort of conscious effort to say something about the world. In that sense, they also become very political creations because, you know, they have an opinion. They engage with the current sort of political and social debate in a way that hasn't really been common, I would say, in video games design in the past. And the difference here, I think this is very important, the difference here is in the intention, right? As Linus said, war is a very, very common theme in games. And again, of course, a series like a game series like the Mario series, for example, you can, you know, it carries with it a lot of political meaning. There's the obvious feminist analysis to be done, obviously, about how Mario and Luigi are both men, and they always rescue a princess who's female from trouble. You know, you never get the other way around. So the men are always very active, the woman is always very passive. That's a sort of, you know, very simple thing, and there's a lot of meaning in that. But there's never, I would argue, there's never been a really conscious effort on the part of the games designers to address that. And in a sense, that means a game like Super Mario Brothers is, at least on one level, it's an intensely apolitical creation, whereas the examples we have on screen here are very political because, as an example, a game like Cart Life attempts to make a very clear and very deliberate point about poverty in contemporary society. They all sort of attempt to illustrate and capture real-life issues, problems, points of debate, and no matter what the exact views that are brought forward, the intention in itself means that these are political creations in a way that hasn't been common in the games industry in the past. So there are, of course, plenty of historical exceptions to this. This is one example, a classic 80s Atari arcade game called Missile Command. Not sure if anyone's familiar. Most people would be, I assume, familiar with Missile Command. Missile Command, it's a game where you protect a series of cities from nuclear bombs that are falling from the sky, right? And this game was created with the stated purpose of making people aware of the horrors of nuclear war. And this is also a game that is described and sort of analyzed in more detail in one of the essays in the State of Play. And it was actually designed and originally titled Armageddon, and it featured attacks on actual cities in California. So these cities that you're protecting would have names of actual cities in California. And for some reason, possibly commercial reasons, this was changed before the game was released into a more sort of generic aliens versus humans scenario, where you're sort of protecting the Earth from an alien onslaught. But I think the most iconic feature of this game was kept in the final release. So when you fail a game of Missile Command, you don't get the traditional game over screen. You get a screen that says the end, right? And this is possibly a subtle hint that all-out war isn't a game that is over, but it could actually spell the literal the end, possibly for all of humankind. So with this in mind, I think you could say that Missile Command is an early example of game designers taking their creations seriously enough, maybe, to realize that their games carry meaning, and it's up to the designer, or it's the designer of the game is free to decide what exactly that meaning should be. It doesn't have to be passive. You can take an active role in that as a games designer. And again, Missile Command and the sort of various ways that this game can be read is the subject of one of the essays in the State of Play by a historian called William Knoblauch, and the essay is titled Game Over, a Cold War Kid Reflects on Apocalyptic Video Games.
Yeah, so another thing that is changing here is the way we talk about games. Traditionally, games have been discussed and reviewed especially more than anything else, like as pieces of technology. Questions like how smooth are the animations and how advanced are the graphics, how well balanced is the gameplay have been central to the reviews. Basically, games criticism has had more in common with the way we would review a mobile phone or a car or even a refrigerator than criticism of literature and music. And again, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. We keep repeating this because people tend to get offended if you talk about something else than these aspects, certain parts of the gaming community. Because this is a perfectly viable way of talking about games. It's basically consumer advice, and in fact, it maybe doesn't even make sense to talk about a game like Uncharted in any other way. Some games are quite expensive. Before you spend $60, $70 on a game, who wouldn't want some straightforward consumer advice? I know I would like that. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with this. But in the past few years, a new generation of critics and academics have begun discussing games that place them more in a social and political context, looking to understand what the games say about the world around it. There is currently a lot of interest in the feminist criticism of games brought forward by, for example, Anita Sarkeesian, seen here, and Catherine Cross, also seen on the other side of the screen there. Two of the most important writers in covering this area today. And there is a growing debate on how non-whites and non-Western minorities are being portrayed in video games. Evan Narcissus, who writes for Gawker and Kotaku, who's seen in the middle here with his daughter, is a key writer in this field. He's also featured. They are all featured with essays in the State of Play. So a couple of more examples of how this discussion is going. One of our contributors is named Hussein Ibrahim. He's a video game journalist based in Beirut, Lebanon, and the former editor-in-chief of one of the largest Arab gaming websites in the world. Hussein absolutely loves first-person shooters. Games like Battlefield and the Call of Duty series are his favorites. The thing is, though, is that as a player in these games, he has noticed that a lot of the people that you will be aiming your gun at will be people will be largely Arab people in Arab countries. So Hussein, when playing, is basically waging war on people like himself in the very games that he loves the most. As he writes, as an American, you get to relate to the hero defending his country from terrorists threatening your freedom. As an Arab, you get to relate to the guy who wants to blow up your city, and that is all. Now, this doesn't mean at all that Hussein abandoned these games and want to encourage others to do so. He's not advocating a boycott at all, because he, like all our contributors, love video games and keeps playing these first-person shooters. But it does make some fascinating points of what it feels like to have people who look like you and talk like you always be the bad guys in the game. Another, The Joy of Virtual Violence is the title of one of the essays. It's written as an exchange of letters between game writers Kara Ellison and Brendan Keogh. And it explores the dynamic that makes us enjoy violent aspects of video games. A lot of gamers are fed up with the talk about violence in games. Some become very defensive when the topic is even brought up. And this is not very surprising, because ever since video games came about, there has been attempts to stigmatize the whole form, or to censor them, or to criminalize sale of certain games to minors, for example. So often done with very little understanding of what games are and what makes us want to play them. But then again, this essay, like all the ones we feature in the book, is rooted in a love of video games. This specifically love of violent, sometimes very gory ones, where a perfectly executed headshot can be the most rewarding action. But Kara and Brendan are also decent people who can be disgusted by violence. And so their exchanges of letters is a sort of an attempt to reconcile these thoughts. And so apparently, obviously, this discussion goes way beyond like the question of whether video games should be as violent as they are, and I'm more interested in asking why violence is such a common theme in games, and what it says about games as a medium, and possibly even about ourselves. Yeah.
Because everyone likes to shoot people in games, right?
Certainly.
I know I do.
Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Right, so we think a good term for describing the shift that we're talking about is post-escapism. And to say that the way we talk about games and the way games are designed is moving into a period of post-escapism. And in essence, this means that we're now beginning to move from a time where games were only talked about and only created as products of entertainment and judged on entertainment value and possibly technical merit alone, into a time where games are and can be discussed and examined based on the way they relate to the world they exist in. And I think, in a way, this is an important coming of age for video games as a medium. Compared, again, if you make the comparison to literature or film, for example, a genre like satire has been around for thousands of years and does exactly the thing we're talking about here. But games, video games is a fairly young medium still, and it's in many ways a fairly immature art form. But right now we're at one of these points where games, and again, the way we talk about games is beginning to take that next step and change into something else, or possibly something more. So this means, one, we're in a very exciting time if you work with games. Two, this is a very exciting time to be writing about or discussing games. And also, me and Linus are convinced that these are very positive developments. Within the games industry, as I'm sure many of you know, there's a long tradition of not being happy with the way games and games culture is portrayed in, say, mainstream circles, without the gaming community, outside the gaming community, the mainstream media, for example. But what is happening here is that these developments are opening doors, or opening a lot of new doors for both video game creators and critics who are, have their background outside of traditional gamer circles. This is giving them ways to relate to the form that haven't really been around in the past. In a sense, by moving closer to the world outside their own, which is exactly what games are doing right now, games are becoming, or have the potential of becoming, much richer experiences and much more mature experiences than in the past, while also opening up for completely new audiences. And these audiences are potentially much, much larger than the ones that games have had in the past. So the State of Play is our attempt to capture what we consider some of the essential voices of this era. The contributors are all game developers, they're critics, and they're academics who all, but in very, very different ways, make their own small contribution to this new way of creating and thinking about games. And if you decide to read it, which we hope, of course, all of you do, we hope it will help you find new and possibly, interesting and possibly new ways of appreciating and understanding this lovely, wonderful form of entertainment that we are talking about here as something to be taken very seriously and something that is to be considered as more than simply entertainment for its own sake. That's it.
Yeah.
Thank you all for listening to it.
We're happy to answer some questions if you have any.
I'm curious, do you guys have a perspective on kind of the social aspect that's starting to develop as we see more and more of the kids, especially teenagers, spending the majority of their social interaction time now online, even counting time they have to spend in school? Being a parent of one of those, I'm kind of curious to get your perspective on it.
Right. So you're talking specifically about like online games and the kind of culture that evolves
and in particular, there? I mean, he spends a lot of time doing team-based activities in the first-person shooters.
Right.
So this is actually it's a good question. This is something we talk about quite a lot in our first book, which is about Minecraft, and specifically about some of the absolutely extraordinary creations that have come out of kids just basically self-organizing around this game and creating some really stunning things using it. I'm a parent also. I have a 2-year-old at home, and he's maybe not big enough to play Minecraft yet, but I'm getting to the point where I'm asking the same questions of myself. I have a very inherently positive view of these things. I'm not convinced that, or I don't really understand why this in itself, why a screen in itself and talking to someone over the internet is a bad thing. Why is that different than talking to someone in real life? I'm not convinced that it is. What I do know is that some really fantastic things can come out of this, and possibly more specifically related to the state of play, which is a book where, naturally, a lot of the discussion we bring up centers around minorities of various sorts, and how minority communities are now beginning to sort of make themselves heard in the gaming community in a way that hasn't been in the past. Again, very positive development, I think. And the internet, by opening up to the rest of the world, means that chances of finding someone who shares your views on things, who shares your struggles in life, are increase exponentially based in compared to how it was in the past. So, yeah, I agree, but I think it's good.
I was curious where you guys think the language that we use to talk about games will come from, because the medium is so young that there's no codified way to sort of talk about it yet. And I was wondering if you guys have any thoughts about where that will come from or what that process might look like.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think just looking at the kind of essays we got to include in the book, they're extremely different. They range from the very academic to the extremely personal. Some of them are written, as I mentioned, as an exchange of letters. There's so many ways of talking about games, and I think there probably will be a multitude of it happening. Compared to, there must be something coming from the fact that games writing and games journalism largely emerged separate from like mainstream media. All mainstream media struggle to cover games. I work for a large daily myself, it's not entirely clear how it should be covered in circles like that. But I think the way you can write about games, the kind of language you can use when talking about games, has been affected by the fact that it has grown separate online more than anything else, and separate from the way we talk about literature, for example, or film. And while it could be influenced by that, it will keep it will be unique in some way as well.
This is actually a really good question, and I think it connects to some of the points we made earlier about how, one, as Linus is saying, games, the sort of discourse around games has its roots in technology, which means we've tended to evaluate games based on technological merit because that's the language that is available. And also, it connects to how the new voices we're trying to highlight in the state of play are coming from, or approaching games from a different perspective, and using language that is perhaps closer to what sort of traditional cultural criticism possibly has been about in the past. And again, this is something that is opening doors. This means that a new generation of critics and academics, but also people who are interested in games design, are able to approach the field and sort of make something interesting out of it without the sort of necessary background or the background in technology that has really been necessary in the past. It also comes down to tools such as Twine. Are you familiar with Twine? Twine is, for those of you who don't know, a platform that can be used to create adventure games, sort of text-based games without programming background. And Anna Anthropy is one of our contributors in the book, hasn't got a coding background, but creates really fascinating experiences with a platform like Twine, which doesn't require you to have a technical background in order to create games. So yeah, it's a really fascinating thing to talk about, actually.
For me personally, one of the things that's always been very special about video games and something that's attracted me to it, and I think that's also a very powerful aspect of games, is the fact that when they're trying to convey a message, you know, it's always a very interactive experience. So as opposed to reading something or watching something, actually stepping into the shoes of someone who's in this particular situation does a very good job of getting these kinds of messages across. But there's been a very large, widespread new consumption of games through things like Let's Play on YouTube and Twitch TV with streaming, and I was wondering what you guys thought about the effects of this more passive consumption of video games as a medium.
So another great question, actually. I agree, and I think a game like Cart Life, if you haven't tried Cart Life, you should check it out. It's a stunning experience when you're, as you say, games make you identify with the choices in a way that isn't really possible in more passive forms of entertainment. And by forcing you to identify with choices like, do I feed my cat or myself? It's a heart-wrenching experience. It's a very, very strong experience that isn't really possible outside of games, I think. I'm not sure. I mean, having said that, some games are very well, I mean, narratively driven games or story-driven games, that isn't the whole picture, you know? So, and some games are very suitable for, I mean, a game like Cart Life wouldn't be as strong if you watch it as a Let's Play, of course, but watching someone play, I'm not sure, I'm a big Dark Souls fan myself, and watching someone play the Dark Souls series on YouTube it's a great experience, because it's sort of, and it's also different because it's more about, it's more about conveying that feeling of playing something with a friend rather than playing it yourself. So, but yeah, I think you're right in that some gameplay experiences can't really be conveyed in that much more passive way, or a lot of the force is perhaps lost in that transition. I haven't got a good answer though, but it's a fascinating point.
Yeah, but and every playthrough will be unique, and every playthrough will, to some extent, tell a different story. So like reading about someone's experience with the game, or watching them play it in a certain way, perhaps could mean could tell a different story every time. One example, there's actually a comedian in Sweden who made a point of trying to play the latest SimCity as a Swedish social democrat, with like the tax levels we have, which isn't even possible in the game. They is like capped way below what we pay. But if you max that out to try to come as close as possible, there will be absolute chaos. Like there will be fires everywhere, and the city you make will just break down and be completely destroyed, and everyone will die. And of course, like that's funny, but it also obviously also says something where the makers of that game came from. So.
Awesome. And again, thanks for coming down to listen to us.
Thanks.